Hello and welcome to the Wise Up with Open Water podcast, your regular dose of wisdom from the open water community. I'm your host, Ken Pasternak. I'm an Open Water founding member as well as a contributor. And I'm happy to welcome today's guest, Julian Durand. Julian, an SVP of Product Management and CSO at Intertrust. And for the last 25 years, Julian has led teams in cybersecurity, secure communications, and IoT infrastructure. He's been the product lead for Explicit Private Networking, or XPN, a secure networking protocol for industrial and IoT use cases. And more recently, Julian was founder of the Trusted Energy Interoperability Alliance, driving zero trust standards for critical infrastructure. So thank you, Julian, for joining me. Lots to unpack there in all your titles and activities, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you today.
Complicated. I just want to clarify one thing, Ken. I'm not personally one of the founders, but Intertrust is one of the founders of TEA, the Trusted Energy Interoperability Alliance.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. That's great.
Mhm.
So my sort of intro question for you, Julian, is what is interoperability? Why is it important for us to be thinking about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really become front and center recently as we see more and more systems dependent on automation, particularly as we've seen recently in the energy grid. And I think everybody's heard about the collapse in Iberia a few weeks ago. Spain and Portugal, they lost 15 gigawatts, like half their capacity in like 5 seconds. And then when they tried to bring on new sources to balance out the grid, they weren't able to because there was such a disparity in the grid. Things were so out of whack that the systems basically shut down, fail-safed off. And a lot of that's because there's so much distributed energy these days. The old paradigm of the grid was their, traditional power plants or thermal, coal-fired power plant, oil, whatever, even nuclear. They have a lot of inertia and they just continue pumping out energy 24/7, 365 in a really predictable way. Unfortunately, the sun isn't nearly so predictable. So they suffered all of a sudden that loss of capacity as they tried to bring in other sources. They weren't able to do it. There was a misunderstood control signal somewhere in the path. And all of a sudden, all these very complicated, distributed, decentralized, interconnected systems couldn't talk to each other properly because they weren't fully interoperable. And what's missing there are many, many standards in electricity. One of the things that's missing within the energy sector, though, is standards around secure, authenticated, authorized messaging to enable the automation we need to do something spectacular like balance out 15 gigawatts of energy in less than 5 seconds. So it's happening all over the place. I mean, interoperability, one of the magics of interoperability is your cell phone just works anywhere it goes in the world today. And there's a lot of different technologies that have to interoperate to make that happen. So we kind of live and breathe it every day, and we only notice it when it kind of falls apart.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talk about complexity, you talk about management, sort of the ability to manage these extremely complex and interdependent systems safely, securely. When they fail, like you just articulated with the Iberian Peninsula, what degree of the risk is just that complexity and that communication capability? What degree of that is, malicious risk? Um, and how do you discern between the two? Do you even need to discern between the two?
That's the really, and that's kind of the complicated thing that we're dealing with today is that as we have more and more requirements for interconnectedness, that also increases the attack surface and the exposure to malicious approaches. And we know well, we've had a really clear lesson in the war in Ukraine that cyber warfare could be very effective. It's played out on the world stage. A good portion of Ukraine's energy infrastructure was not taken out by bombs and missiles, it was taken out by very sophisticated cyber attacks. And so, with this exposure, together with the fact that we need to connect more and more disparate systems, it becomes a really difficult problem between, you know, what is just complicated and falling apart because it's complicated, and what is a security failure. And they're related. because complication is the enemy of security. The more complicated things are, the security wonks call it the attack surface, the more that grows, the more the opportunity to attack the system opens up. So what's needed for that are very clear guidelines and essentially compliance rules to make sure everybody's playing in the same way, using the same language, and particularly using the same language for security, meaning protocols, keys, key types, cryptography, including crypto agility, going to post-quantum crypto is really important. And so that's really the solution. And we've been able to manage that solution in the cell phone network. And now it just works, and we're astonished when it doesn't. We have to bring that same level of security and interoperability into our industrial control systems and critical infrastructure.
Yeah, when I think about critical infrastructure, energy obviously is the one that you've already talked about. Why is that so vulnerable? What is it about energy or critical infrastructure that, you say we're doing it pretty well with cell service, which is newer, right? Is it the age? Is it the amount of time over which these things have been built, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's related. It's a great question. It's very much related to that, and it's that the and nobody really anticipated when they designed the security architecture for industrial control systems, the so-called Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture is the typical five-layer model in industrial control systems. Nobody ever anticipated they would be connected to an open network like the internet. It predates the prevalence of the internet. And then there's been this fashion over the last 20 years that everything needs to be connected. And and especially the last 10 years with the data that's been derived from these systems and the ability to optimize things and then bring in industrial automation. And then increasingly, of course, AI makes that even more powerful. There's an incredible thirst to connect these systems. So systems that shouldn't be connected from a security point of view are connected anyway from a convenience optimization point of view. And let me give you an example of this, just how widespread and concerning it is. The Department of Homeland Security, a couple of years ago, did an audit of every single utility in the United States. And they were auditing one thing, and that is the so-called air gap. Because
Hmm.
these industrial control systems are, as I said, not supposed to be connected to the public internet. The result of the audit is that every single utility failed. In their report, they showed that every single utility had traversed the air gap, and in some cases, they traversed it with hundreds of connections. And in
Wow.
many cases, they weren't even aware of it. Um, and so that tells me two stories. One is it's true, the access to the data and the systems is so valuable, you'll put aside the security concerns. And the second thing, I guess, kind of obvious, is that these systems are really insecure.
Yeah. I'm sitting here thinking about like a doomsday scenario where like, somebody's smart light bulb suddenly decides because who knows why, it just decides that it's going to become a nefarious actor and it because these air gaps have been crossed, which I understand an air gap to be basically some sort of physical distance, some sort of physical separator between the infrastructure itself and the internet. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
yeah, yeah. It's a term of art. It's just you got it right though. Completely separate networks with no electricity tying, like they should supposed to be a gap of air between them.
Yeah. So instead of having a bunch of open water members going and unscrewing their smart light bulbs from the from their ceilings or worrying too much about this instability, this insecurity that we're talking about, what can be done? What is being done? You talked about standards before. I want to talk a little bit about those words zero trust.
Mhm.
How do zero trust standards and others get applied to manage these vulnerabilities? What is happening today? What is going to happen to, you know, avoid some of these scenarios that we've been talking about?
So in in our enterprises generally, in our corporations, including, the corporations that are three-letter agencies, national defense and other agencies. Corporations and government run very sensitive systems that, if compromised, can cause serious problems. And because of that, IT has generated and really created really sophisticated frameworks for securing those networks. And over the last several years, IT learned the hard way. There's, God, so many breaches. Every day there's a new breach, and it still continues to happen. And a realization came, should have been obvious, I suppose, but the realization was that you're not able to fully secure everything.
Mm.
There's not a CISO in the world that can just sit down and say, zero risk, we got everything covered. There's just too many moving parts. And one of the biggest vulnerabilities in a network are us bags of water at the keyboard. Um, and that's why spam and that kind of stuff is so effective, right? Um, but over the years, there was this realization that you can't trust even things within your own network. And so you need to change the paradigm from trusting everything within a perimeter, inside your firewalls, inside your castle walls, if you will. Instead of trusting everything on the inside, you challenge everything. So
Mm.
you verify every connection, you authenticate every person when they log in, you authenticate every machine, every application, everything needs to be challenged. That's really the essence of it. And then you build in other elements like the principle of least privilege, strong authorizations. And in that way, even if you do suffer some sort of a breach, it's easier to contain it and stop lateral movement through the network or escalating to privileges if you can catch it early enough. And that's really the essence of it. And the way it's been developing is that the new perimeter is no longer the castle walls, but it's really identity.
Mm.
Identity is the new perimeter. And it is really still in the day of decentralized systems and the cloud, the one thing that a CISO, a security practitioner, can keep control of. And so it's really maintaining the authenticity of an identity and the authorized privileges it has. And that, in a nutshell, is not much of a nutshell. I kind of rambled on. I'm sorry. But that's what the transition to zero trust is really meant.
Okay. I actually liked one of the phrases you used, which was challenge everything. Instead
Mhm.
of trust nothing, you said challenge everything, which I like that because there are two human responses, right? There is the fear response, the negative response, or there's the positive response, the capacity building response, which is, oh, we're going to challenge everything.
Right. Yeah.
I like that. I like that standpoint. And actually it leads to another question, which is, you know, the cell phone network metaphor that you brought up a couple times, or the example that you brought up a couple times, tracks with me because yeah, it works for the vast majority of time. It just works. And people like me, I rely on technology every single day. I don't manage these systems. I have no real input to how these systems are managed. So I'm wondering how these principles and lessons apply to me and how I should be thinking about this, or what sort of questions I should be asking.
Hmm. That's a really good question, Ken. I think one of the most important principles in all this is that the application of security should be both fundamental and simple and
Huh.
easy to use. Um, if it's not easy to use, users will find a way around it. So
Yeah.
there was a time when multi-factor authentication wasn't very common. And
Hmm.
multi-factor authentication, as you know, is you get an extra text message with a code or use an application, which is better, of course, right? But prior to that, the security was to have humans have very complicated passwords. Do you remember that era?
Yeah.
Um, and not just a very complicated password, but a different password for every one of the many systems you access, and that you should change it every 3 months, right? So now you've got this alphanumeric, 15 character password for 200 different systems. It doesn't work. So what user would do is they'd have a yellow sticky note on the computer and have all their passwords on it. which then just completely turns the security problem into just getting the sticky notes off of somebody's computer, right? Um, so, so as just a user of systems, I think what you want to look for are using well certified systems.
Mm.
Like in the IT world, you want your suppliers to be SOC 2 or ISO 27000 certified, for instance. These are international standards for security, for instance. Um, you want to get your firewalls from well-known vendors like
Mhm.
Fortinet, Palo Alto Networks. You know, the cheap new fly-by-night has a better thing is probably not the way you want to go. I think maturity and longevity in this business is really important.
Okay. I'm sorry. Keep going if you had something else.
I'm just saying, and then at the end, it's really up to us as individuals to be careful. Be careful about, emails where you don't know the source, and don't click on a link that may be hazardous. A single link can compromise your computer and your network instantly. So it's also about just being very careful about who you communicate with.
Yeah, I like that. I appreciate, looking for things like you said SOC 2 and ISO. What was it? ISO?
ISO 27001. Yeah.
27001. Multi-factor authentication, of course, is a way of life these days. And, I personally have shifted from being kind of annoyed that I have to, get on my phone and repeat the code to being grateful that I'm being looked after. That is a process that is looking for my own,
Uh-huh.
individual safety. So I guess it's awareness, it's choices that we make to buy products and or work with service providers who are using these standards.
Mhm.
I work for an organization that does the annual spear phishing and spam and
Mhm.
malicious malware training, and
Yep.
pay
Yep.
close attention to that and notice when these things are happening. I
Yep.
think those are
That
all
stuff's
great
really
practices.
important. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
I've become very unpopular in my organization because I push that a lot, and I, I use a service that has synthetic phishing emails.
Uh-huh.
They're so authentic, and they still catch so many people. And then when they get caught, they get frustrated, and I get a nasty gram from them. But it's an essential part of this, and
Like, I'm just trying to help.
yeah, just try to make
I
things better
mean,
for
I
all.
work for a pretty small organization, and one of your junior employees just went off and bought $2,500 worth of gift cards because he thought the CEO told him to. That makes an impact.
Yeah, 100%. Yep. Yep. And all sorts of. Another thing is to keep aware and up to date on these things because multi-factor authentication is a perfect case in point where it started off by sending over the SMS channel to your cell phone, right?
Hmm.
Some of them still use that. But the newer and better way is to use an authentication app like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, because, as it turns out, all of our or most of our cellular networks are all compromised. And so these codes can be intercepted. And so now SMS as a factor of authentication is no longer considered a very good one. So
Wow.
bit
Yeah.
of a tip. If you're using that for your banking, you'll want to change the way you do your banking.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, complexity we talked about earlier on, but just change and the pace of change is also something I guess we all have to keep up with. So, we've talked a lot about vulnerability and risk, and obviously these things are real. And you are very close to all of it, and you see it, from a professional and expert lens. What are you optimistic about?
That's a very good question. I've always seen the application of security technologies as enablers for things that weren't possible before in the digital realm. Let me give you an example. In the early days of my career, I worked on protecting music. And that was back in the days of, Napster and, free music and all that kind of stuff. And it really took out the recording industry and affected a lot of artists and things like that. Building back the ability to protect content enabled these industries to come back. I've been in a different flavor and things like that, but you wouldn't be getting the incredible, wide range of entertainment sources you get from Spotify and Netflix and all these sources today if they didn't all have protected premium content. And that protection becomes quite significant. The protection capabilities in TVs and cell phones to protect content are generally considered military level digital security capabilities. eSIM's another example. It used to be that when you went to Europe, for instance, you had to go to a corner store and get a physical SIM and plug it in and things like that. You can do all of that electronically now, of course, right? You could buy 2 hours of data when you're in London and then 20 gigabytes of data in France, right? So, so making new things possible with security, I think is what makes me feel positive. And particularly while we have these issues today of a large attack surface, complicated interconnections, especially in dis decentralized distributed energy systems, we can secure those. I mean, we have the technology. And by securing those, it means that increasingly we can authenticate the industrial automation, we can authenticate the AI. And by doing that, we can move to greener and greener energy sources, have much less expensive energy through massive automation that we trust inherently because we have such good security in it. And that's kind of the new frontier. You know, we figured it out for content, we figured it out for things like eSIMs, and now I think this is the new promising frontier in energy and all of our industrial control systems, factories, water systems. There's so many different industrial control systems.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. Always want to make sure we're looking on the optimistic side of things. And you're right. I mean, so many things that we do today and even take for granted. Imagine where we were. I just saw my nephew graduate from high school, and I'm thinking when I graduated from high school, so many things that happened today just were not even, nobody could even imagine them. And here
Mhm.
we are. And for the most part, with breaches here and there, but we're doing it.
Yeah.
Um, so we've covered a lot of ground here. I'm wondering if there are two or three things that you would say as sort of a wrap up or sum up your advice for listeners, open water members, people who are professionals, either ways to think or just kind of things to be aware of, that you've been made aware of through your work.
Yeah, yeah. I guess it's just the advice I give to family and friends. You know, there's, outside of the corporate environment, it's always be vigilant, always be suspicious. When even when you're talking to so-called trusted parties like your bank, always verify. Um, Always keep your software up to date. Like when you get
Mhm.
these patches in on Microsoft, patching Tuesday or your Mac iOS or whatever, update right away because these patches are almost always coming out because some vulnerability has been found and being exploited in the wild. So always keep your software up to date. Never click on links from people you don't know. And yeah, I'd say those are the top three.
That's great. Very helpful, very specific, and yeah, stuff that every one of us can do every day, even if we find it annoying sometimes.
Yep.
Um, so you've given us a lot. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise, your background, some of the things that you've seen and that you're dealing with these days. I'd wonder if there anything the community can do for you.
Um, well, the community's been wonderful. It's we were just talking about it earlier. It's just a really interesting, friendly group of kind of like-minded individuals, and I'd like to spend more time with it and get to know the community and the people more. Um, I think the best thing that you could do for me is practice safe computing, so it doesn't cause a bigger problem.
Thank you for that, Julian. So how can open water listeners reach you if they'd like to follow up?
I am Julian Durand on LinkedIn, um, and on Twitter, Durand Julian.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Julian. It's great to be able to speak with you today. Thank you for sharing again your wisdom, your expertise, and taking us down a road that many of us probably don't think about very often. But now we know that we can have an impact on zero trust and other issues related to interoperability.
That's awesome.
So
Thanks.
enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you at the next open water event.
Awesome, man. Take care.
Thank you.